everyone. Welcome to DPS Summit 2020. My name is Mohammad Kabiruddin. I'm a program manager in the Azure SQL data team. I'm here with my colleague Rajesh today. Rajesh, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, Mohammad. Thanks, Mohammad. My name is Rajesh. I work as a senior program manager in Azure SQL Engineering, currently focusing on migration space.
Great. So today we are here to talk about understanding your SQL Server readiness to migrate databases to Azure SQL using our database assessment and migration tools. So today's topic is focused on ensuring that you get the right level of assessment done on your databases to ensure that during your migration, your process is as seamless as possible to move to Azure SQL. So when you think about migration of your SQL servers, before you even jump into the tools, you need to understand the 5 key steps or the 5 key stages in your migration journey so you're better equipped with how the process works. The first thing you should start off with is do a discovery of your SQL Server estate. And by discovery, we mean that you go and create an inventory of your servers, look at your workload types, capture all the information that you possibly can, to then go to the next phase of this assessment. Now, in assessment, you dive into individual database servers, do perf counters analysis, do performance analysis, figure out the feature parity, compatibility issues, to ensure that you get a complete readiness report before you move to Azure SQL. Now, one of the key things that you need to make note of during your assessment phase is that you produce a report of whether your database is suitable or not to move to the right SKU within Azure SQL. Once you've completed your assessment, in most of your organizations, you will need to come up with a pricing estimate to get sign off from your executives, or to proceed to the next phase as well. So that's also another key component of the first 2 parts of your migration. During migration, it's important to make note that you need to factor in the downtime that's required for applications. You can either do a migration that causes very minimal downtime for applications, or a migration that requires an extended downtime. Again, there are many factors to consider there, things like your network bandwidth, throughput, the size of your databases, the number of objects in your databases, all that plays a part in the migration phase. The second last step before we wrap up the journey is after migration. Most often we think that the migration process is over, let's go and run our workloads in Azure. But people tend to miss out on the key aspect of cutting over seamlessly to Azure SQL. What that means is making sure your application is disconnected and connected to the new target Azure SQL platform, also making sure that any other dependencies downstream are taken care of, and basically ensuring that your new Azure SQL platform is ready to go from an application standpoint. Once your cutover is complete, the optimization phase kicks in, which is basically an evolving phase after your migration process to start looking at how can you leverage all the bells and whistles of Azure SQL platform that brings together things like security, your cost optimization, and so on. It's important to do that because some of the things that work differently on premises will benefit from the capabilities of platform as a service in Azure SQL. So some of the key things there are making sure you've turned on encryption, making sure you've optimized your costs with licensing benefits, and making sure you further optimize your costs with reserved cores or reserved instances. Lastly, for best practices, not just for migrations, but for landing your platforms in Azure in general, you can look at Cloud Adoption Framework, which gives you a whole bunch of guidance around making sure your scaffolding in Azure is right, you've set up the right environment, and your resources are skilled to do operations on Azure and so on. With that, Rajesh, can you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so we just spoke about the various stages in the migration journey. Let's talk about the tools that can help you do that. In this session, we are going to focus purely on the assessment tools and how we can leverage those tools to understand your SQL Server readiness. But we'll also touch upon how these assessment tools can help you migrate. Now, at a high level, we've got under assessment, we've got Azure Migrate, SSMA, DMA, and DEA. Let's go into each of these in a little more detail. So Azure Migrate is Azure service that can help you migrate servers, databases at scale. And this is a one-stop shop for doing all your migration assessments, discovery, migrations, and optimization. And again, this has become a central hub for many of our migrations, not just for databases, but also for VMs and Windows servers and so on. So Azure Migrate is your platform if you want to look at end-to-end migrations at scale. Now, when you talk about databases specifically, we have SSMA, which is basically meant for heterogeneous migrations from databases like Oracle to SQL. And that's what SSMA does for in terms of assessing your Oracle estate to give you the recommendations and readiness reports to migrate to SQL. The next tool is DMA, which we'll be talking a lot about today, which is a data migration assistant, and that's primarily used for homogeneous SQL migrations and assessments, and specifically around assessing your on-premise SQL service to understand readiness of feature parity, compatibility, and which my colleague Rajesh will talk to about in detail. And DMA is basically meant to do your assessments both for single line of business applications and at scale using automation. And lastly, database experimentation assistance, or DEA, is a kind of A/B testing tool which primarily runs a workload on your on-premise SQL server, compares that to your target, and gives you the analysis or performance analysis between the two so that you make the right decision. So once you've completed your assessment, we have a specific Azure service called Azure DMS, or Database Migration Service. The difference between Azure DMS and other tools like DMA is that DMA is a desktop tool that can be installed on your machine or a server of your choice, whereas DMS is an Azure service that spins up in Azure and runs in Azure. So Azure Database Migration Service is our go-to platform for doing migrations at scale. It has a whole bunch of automation built in, complex advanced features that can help you migrate databases to Azure SQL. Now, the kind of sources that we support for assessments and migrations vary from, not just SQL Server. We support databases like Oracle. We support open source databases like Postgres, MariaDB, and we support assessment of databases from third-party cloud providers. And we make sure that using these tools, you can land your databases in the right Azure SQL target, if it's SQL, or on the right Azure database target for other platforms. With that, I will hand back to Rajesh to start discussing about these tools in a lot more detail, and then we'll circle back on some of the migration concepts a bit later.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Rajesh,
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks for the detailed overview of the whole migration journey, what customers have to go through, and then the various sources and targets and the assessment and migration tools that Microsoft have invested heavily for letting customers to accelerate the migration journey. One of the tools that we want to talk about in this session is Azure Migrate and how it's integrated closely with Data Migration Assistant, which is DMA. So when Mohammed was talking about Azure Migrate, this is like a one central hub for the entire data center migration. This is one-stop shop for all your migration needs. It supports migrations of servers, databases, applications. It helps you to detect dependencies between your applications, dependency between your VMs, and then seamlessly move those workloads into Azure. For the specific case for today, what we're going to talk about is the integration of a database migration assistant with the Azure Migrate. What typically happens when you run a database migration assistant tool, as Mohammed was mentioning, this is a standalone tool. But then the power of integration is once you run the standalone tool and run your assessments on-prem, you can upload all the assessments into Azure Migrate and then view the assessment results in a central location for your entire data estate. This could vary from, let's say, you group a bunch of servers based on your applications, and then now you want to view the readiness state of those SQL Server instances to figure out if those are ready for SQL Pass, be it Singleton DB, or if those are ready for a managed instance, or if they're ready to go to SQL VM. And that's what we will talk about in the session. I also have a demo right after the slide, and I'll go into details talking about this. In terms of the other capabilities that DMA exposes, it also helps you to give you SKU recommendations. We have published a doc article talking about how you can collect the data for a certain period of time, use the DMA SKU recommendation to get the appropriate size for your SQL DB or SQL MI, and it also gives you a high-level pricing calculations as well as some automation scripts where you can directly use to provision your target SQL DB or SQL MI. With that, let's quickly move on into a demo. I'll show an overview of DMA and the integration of DMA with SSMA. So once you have installed DMA, if you can search for Database Migration Assistant download, and then you install DMA, which is a standalone tool, you can launch DMA as a standalone desktop tool. Once it's opens up, there are a couple of options that will show up. I'm just waiting for this to show up the options. There you go. So we'll start with starting an assessment. Let's say in this case, we want to do an assessment. Let's say we want to do an assessment for Azure SQL DB, and then you choose the assessment type, which is a database engine. We also support other types of assessments like integration services, but for the purpose of this demo, we'll stick to database engine. My source is SQL Server, and my target is Azure SQL Database. I'll create an assessment. And in the assessment phase, you have a couple of options to choose from. You can enable the database compatibility check. What it does is it goes and evaluates each and every database, trying to figure out from the current compatibility, and then it evaluates for any higher level compatibility if there are any discontinued features or breaking changes features that have to be surfaced or that have to be taken care before you start the migration. And typically these are the things that will break the application functionality, affecting the performance or scalability of your application queries. So you would want to enable that. And then it also does a feature parity check. This would do an evaluation of all the features that are enabled on your source SQL Server instance and check if those source SQL Server features are available in SQL database. And if they aren't, it will give you a clear warning that, hey, these are migration blockers. Some of these features are not yet supported. Let's say, for example, Service Broker, which is not supported. And then the workaround in that case is to evaluate if your source SQL Server instance is ready for SQL MI. So all of that is possible with both these options. So once I select the options that I want to use for assessment, I'll connect to the source instance. In this case, I have a SQL 2016 instance. Let me connect to the instance. And let's say for the purpose of this demo, I want to assess all the databases in this instance. And towards the bottom right corner, I also want to highlight DMA has an option where you can provide the extended event files that have been captured for the application workload. This is helpful in scenarios where you want to assess the queries that are being running from the application. Let's say these queries are dynamically generated by the application, and you want to assess those queries for any, let's say, discontinued or breaking changes that might surface up in the target Azure SQL DB. So that's one thing that I want to talk about. And then once you add all the databases, we also have the capability to assess application queries that are embedded right within the source code. So we support both C#, Java code, and we also have a link here that talks about how to set it up. So this is a tool that's called Data Access Migration Toolkit. It can be installed as an extension to the Azure Data Studio. Once you do that, it scans the entire source code, extracts out SQL Server connectivity information or any application queries which are directly submitted from the application. In that way, you can assess both your database objects, which are persistent on the database, and also queries that are dynamically generated or queries that are hard-coded within the application. So that way you cover the entire gamut of all the queries that are hitting the application. So with that, let me start the assessment. We'll not wait for this assessment to finish. For the purpose of the demo, I already ran an assessment a while ago. And once the assessment runs, you would have these two options. You would start with feature parity, wherein, as you see in this case, it shows up any features which are available at the instance level but not available yet in SQL DB. For example, SQL Server agent jobs which are not yet available in SQL DB, but it also gives you a recommendation that you can go and use Elastic Jobs, which is a nice replacement for SQL Server agent jobs. And then we can also get the compatibility level issues. So these are the issues. Let's say, let's pick an example for the archive database. So it tells us that in this database, there are 3 migration blockers. Let's say the first one is talking about SP configure. These are something that I staged for the purpose of the demo. I'm using an SP configure option, which is not yet supported. So it will highlight that. Let's say I have a file stream file group. It'll give you a migration blocker warning because this is not yet supported in Azure SQL DB. And let's say I also have a table with a file stream column. So it will give you the exact details around what is the table that's been used and why this is a migration blocker. So in this way, you get a neat, detailed, comprehensive assessment of your source SQL Server instance, and then you can figure out all the databases which are ready for SQL DB, and then identify the issues that you need to go and work with your application team in order to make your database ready for SQL database. And the other feature which I want to talk about is uploading to Azure Migrate. So this is the integration feature that I was talking about a while earlier, where you can integrate the assessments that are run from SQL from DMA into Azure Migrate so that that becomes like a central repository. But better yet, since this is a standalone tool, it would be inhuman or it would not be scalable option where you connect to every SQL Server instance, select or deselect databases, and then upload the results back into Azure Migrate. Instead, what you can do is we can use a command line CLI option, which is the DMA cmd.exe, and then connect to a bunch of SQL Server instances, do the assessments at scale, upload the assessments into Azure Migrate, and then view the results. So let me show you how that looks like. So once DMA is installed, you can go into the installed folder, and then there's a CLI tool utility called DMA cmd.exe. So this utility helps you to perform all the actions that you can do from the UI right from the command line. So it can do target assessments. It can do assessments for a specific target. Let's say you want to target it for SQL DB, you want to target it for SQL MI. It can do all of those capabilities. And for the purpose of this demo, let me run the command. Let me clean this up. For the purpose of this demo, what I want to show you is we'll do an assess action, but in this case, instead of connecting manually to a source SQL Server instance, we'll use a configuration file. Let's say I have a configuration file. You can provide it in the form of an XML, and this is how the XML looks like. So what you do is you give a name to the assessment, similar to what we did in the UI tool. We give the source platform. This is SQL on-prem. We give the target platform. Since we are assessing for SQL database, this is SQL database. If you want to assess for managed SQL DB, then you also have an option to do that. And here are a couple of examples where in the first example, I'm trying to connect to a SQL 2016 instance, and I want to assess all the DBs in the instance. That's the first example. But let's say in cases where you want to assess a couple of databases in instance, and this is the second example where I've picked 2 databases here. In the SQL 27 instance, one is the AdventureWorks 2017, and then there's the Wide World Importers DW, so that you can pick and choose the database that you want to assess. So once you specify the assessment databases, then you have the option to save the results. There are 3 output formats for DMA. One is the native .dma format that you can save into, and then you can also save into .json or .csv file if you want to export it into an Excel and then view the results in an Excel file. So you have an option to do that. And then other options around if you want to overwrite result, you can set it to true. And then the 2 UI options that we are talking about were compatibility and feature parity. So you can enable that to true. And then here are the options that the parameters that the XML file expects in order for you to integrate the assessments back into Azure Migrate. So here we start with mentioning the Azure cloud environment, which is the Azure public cloud. If you want to upload it to any Gov cloud or Mooncake clouds, the China cloud, you can still do that. Or if you want to use any other Gov clouds, then you can also do that. In addition, what you also need is a subscription ID, and then you have to provide the Azure Migrate project name. So in order to provide the Azure Migrate project name, let me quickly show how that looks like in the portal. So if you go into the Azure portal and search for Azure Migrate, which is a fully managed PaaS service, you search up for Azure Migrate. Once this shows up, in my case, I've already created a project, so that's why I'm into this landing page. But if you were not into the landing page, what you would start from is you would start creating a project, and let me show you how that looks like. So when you start initially, you would start at this screen where you have selected the subscription. You can provide a resource group. You can give an Azure project name, and then you can specify location. So once that is done, you will use the resource group and the migrate project name into the XML file here as an input, so that once the assessment is performed here, it will get uploaded back into the Azure Migrate project and then into the resource group. And then few options around, hey, enable the interactive authentication, the Active Azure Directory tenantry. If you go into your Azure Active Directory, in the summary blade, you would see your tenant ready. And then I want to enable the assessment and then upload the assessment to Azure Migrate. That's what I would set it up to do. So once the command completes, you would get the information here, which tells you that how many instances were assessed. Let's say in this case, we had 2 instances, and then the number of databases that it has assessed. So this will give you a confirmation of how the assessment ran, and then what are the final stats of the assessment. So once the assessments are completed, which I've done earlier in preparation for this demo, you would go into Azure Migrate. And then when you click on databases, you would have this information where it tells you all the statistics that we just saw over in the command prompt. Information about the number of instances were assessed, information about the number of databases, and then the readiness state of those databases for SQLDB or SQL VM. So let's get into a couple of the instances. So in this case, let's look into SQL 2016 instance. As you can see in this instance, this is 64% ready. There are a bunch of databases which are ready for SQLDB, but there are also a few which are not ready. If you want to get into those level of details, you would get into select the instance, and then you would get all those details. So as we were looking into the other demo, which is around the archive database, you have 3 migration blockers for archive database, and then you also have other migration blockers for different databases. So this gives you a central holistic place for you to look at the readiness state of your SQL Server instances and databases that you want to move to Azure Cloud. And then it also gives you if this database is ready for SQLDB or if it is ready for SQL VM. The other instance which I was assessing is SQL 2017. In this case, there are 2 DBs. Unfortunately, both of them have no blockers. This is completely ready to move into Azure SQLDB. So as you can see, Azure Migrate is like one central shop, and it gives you a centralized view of your readiness estate of your entire SQL Server data estate. So with that, we can go back into DMA. If you want to get into those details around what were the actual migration blockers for those databases, you can always open up the .dma file and then get into details. Let's say you pick a different database and then want to figure out what are the migration blockers. You get all the low-level blocker information and the recommendations that you have to follow to get to and then follow the mitigation steps and then get to migrate to SQLDB. With that, let me get back into the slide. I just want to touch upon few best practices while assessing at scale. So some of these best practices are geared towards making sure you get the assessments perform successfully at scale. So these are pretty basic recommendations which are around, instead of assessing all SQL Server instances in your entire data center, the recommendation is to start based on a particular application, group your SQL Server instances based on an application, let's say group it up into 50 or 100, and then try to run the assessments. And the other recommendation is if you want to run the assessments for both SQLDB and SQLMI, you remember the screen where I was showing you how do you create an Azure Migrate project? The recommendation is to create independent Azure Migrate projects, one for SQLDB, one for SQLMI, so that when you upload the results, those are saved separately in those Azure Migrate projects, and the results don't get overwritten, so that you have the centralized view for readiness of your on-prem SQL Server databases, both for Singleton DB or for managed instance. And the last thing which I want to touch upon is assessment is proportional to the number of database objects that you have in a particular database, and primarily it consumes CPU cycles. So the VM or the server from where you want to run the scale assessments, make sure you have enough CPU resources and CPU cores in order to run the assessments. And you can also test it. I mean, you could start with few handful instances, see how much time it takes based on the schema, and then try to expand it to a much larger scope of SQL Server instances so that you get those holistic view of your entire SQL Server data estate. With that, let's move on into the actual migration into DMA. I want to pass it down back to Mohammed.
So we just saw how Rajesh showed you to use DMA to do an assessment, produce a report, upload it to Azure Migrate, do it at scale using automation and command line, and give you that whole full assessment report that gives you the assurance that once your database is moved to Azure SQL, they will run as expected, or if there are any breaking or behavioral changes, that will get highlighted before you moving to Azure. Now, there's also a migration component of Data Migration Assistant. Though it is meant to do assessments at a deeper scale, there's also ability to do migrations to Azure SQL Database or Azure Virtual Machines on using SQL. So we'll dive into this in a demo and show you how we can do a migration of a database using DMA. But I just want to quickly call out that DMA can do both data and schema migrations and not just limit itself to schema or data like some of the other tools do. But also it captures as database users and migrates them across. If you have database users mapped to your database on premises, it'll make sure that it'll create that login and map it to the right databases on Azure SQL Target. We'll again cover this in the demo. So as I mentioned, DMA is capable of migrating databases to either Azure SQL Database or SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. If you want to migrate to Azure SQL Managed Instance, your migration tool of choice should be Azure Database Migration Service, or DMS. Azure DMS, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, is an Azure service that runs on Azure, and the compute is provided by Azure to run your migration seamlessly. Again, a lot of automation can be done using Azure DMS, using REST API and PowerShell and CLI, but also it is built to scale and handle failures, and it's resilient to any interruptions. So make sure you attend other sessions in DPS Summit that cover database migrations at scale. We have our colleagues who are presenting these sessions on migrations. We'll mention those sessions towards the end of this presentation so you can have a look at them. Okay, with that, we will get into a demo and quickly show you how DMA can be used to do migrations. So I have a virtual machine set up where I'm running a SQL Server 2016 instance. As you can see, I've logged into Management Studio, and I have a database, which is a TPCC database that I'm ready to move to Azure. The first thing I would do is open up DMA and run an assessment. To do an assessment of the database, make sure that it's ready to move to Azure. My colleague Rajesh just showed you how you can do that. So I'm going to skip the assessment bit and jump straight into migration. And what I'm intending to do here is to move this database from my current on-premises SQL Server to Azure SQL Database. And I want to do both schema and data migration. You can do either of these as well. But since I want to do everything together, I'll choose schema and data. I'll give it a name. We call it DPS migration. Demo. I hit create. So it'll give me this wizard-based approach where I can provide the details. So my server is, I'm running DMA on my SQL Server. So to select local host, I'll give it the credentials. Make sure I can connect to it. So I have two databases here. The one I'm interested to migrate is my TPCC database. And a nice little option you get here if you forget to do assessment is also to do assessments while you're doing migration. So I'll show you that experience. So you can check this box and allow for this database to be assessed before it gets migrated. So if I leave this on and go next, let me select my target database, which is So this is my target SQL database on Azure, and I will give it the credentials, test the connection. So as you can see, this is my target Azure SQL DB. One key thing to note here is that by default, when you set up an Azure SQL database, it is obviously built with the Evergreen SQL code base. It has the latest version, and it has the highest compatibility level. So by default, it's set to compatibility level 150. However, if you're migrating databases from on-premises with a lower compatibility, you can either set that lower compatibility at the source level before you migrate, or after you migrate, if you want to lower the compatibility, you can do so by doing an alter compatibility level. So either way, you get the option of choosing to run your workloads at the same compatibility in Azure as it was on premises, if you wish to. So once you enter your details and you're able to connect to your target SQL DB, when you hit next, it'll show you the list of objects that are available for migration. But because we chose assessment as an option during migration, it also did a quick assessment to tell you if there are any changes or breaking or behavioral changes. So as you can see from this, there are these two objects, stored procedures, that have behavioral changes. And if you click on these, you can get details on what those behavioral changes are. And in this case, these are unqualified joins. For them, I'm happy to migrate, and I'm happy to remediate this after migration. Or if you want to go back and fix it, you can do so, right? If you choose not to do the assessment and you just go select migration, that will skip the assessment bit. As you can see, it was pretty instant because it skipped the whole assessment, and you don't get any warnings on any migration blockers or behavioral changes. So once you come to the screen, you can select all the objects that you want to migrate. Plus the users that you want to migrate. And this is a nice little feature where you don't have to really worry about your database users. You can check them here, and DMA will ensure that those database users are created on your target Azure SQL DB. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to just do one user migration, and you can see how that whole happens. So after this, I'll click on Generate SQL Script. It produces a script that can be executed to deploy your schema objects. You can either save this and do it offline, or if you want to deploy it using the tool, you can do so. So I'm just going to go deploy this, and you can see the status here. And I just quickly want to show you how we spoke about migrating users. It created a login for that user on your target database server, and it also created that database user. So that's an interesting little feature that you have with DMA, where it does it automatically for you. Plus, as you can see, it created all the database objects for you. And again, this process is repeatable because it's scripted out in a way that if you rerun this again, it will make sure that it doesn't cause any conflicts. So once I'm satisfied, I've done the deployment, I click on migrate data. So this is the main core of the migration process, where all your objects are ready to be migrated. It shows you a row count, and it gives you a status to say whether it's ready to move. Once you've checked all your boxes, you're all good to go. You click on Start Data Migration. And given the large number of rows in these tables, some of these tables, it can take anywhere between a few seconds to a couple of minutes for this particular database. When I did a test run, it took about 2 minutes. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes for this migration to complete, and we'll come back to this. In the meantime, I quickly want to talk about how you can even go one step beyond and monitor what's happening on SQLDB. So in my Azure SQL database, I've connected to using SSMS. I can see that database. If I go quickly look at resource stats and these two DMVs, which are quite useful, you can look at both your resource consumption and your resource governance on the target SQL DB without having to go to the Azure portal. So first thing, if you look at DM user DB resource governance, you can look at, this is a bit tiny, so I'm just going to use a magnifier, bring this up. So here you can see details about your database, target SQL database. You can see the SKU you've chosen, the maximum number of cores you have, and other details like your max log percentage. You have, things like data IO, max pool IO, max workers. So all the nitty-gritty details of that SQL database, which can be tricky to find on the portal, you can get it from this DMV. Now, another DMV that's useful during migrations is this one, which is DMDB resource stats. And this basically tells you the consumption pattern of various resources. So as an example, we just did the migration, and you can see during this migration, the data IO percent was increased. Before that, it was all 0. And as the migration started, it spiked up a little bit. You've got the data IO, you've got CPU percentage, you've got the log write percentage, and all these are captured. So again, these two DMVs are super useful for you to monitor using SSMS during your migrations. So let's just quickly switch back to DMA and make sure that everything is successful. As you can see, all the tables have been migrated, no errors, and everything was pretty much done in about 2 minutes and 6 seconds. So this just gives you the capability of migrating your databases from on-premises SQL Server to Azure SQL Database or SQL Server on Azure VMs. As I mentioned, for managed instance, we do not currently support DMA. You will have to switch to DMS to do managed instance migrations. Another trick is also to monitor your migrations from the portal. So I've created a dashboard. I'm just going to quickly refresh and see. Here you go. So we've created a dashboard to monitor the log generation rate, the log IO, the data IO, and CPU to see how it performed during migration. So as we just finished the migration, you can see here it spiked up pretty significantly for log IO to about 60%. Data IO not so much, 30%. And this is, again, all of this aligns with what we saw in the DMV. The DMV is an exact replica of this in a tabular form. And CPU was fairly minimal at about 10%. So what this tells us is that during migration, it's important to keep a track on your log IO. If it hits anywhere near the ceiling of 100%, then no matter how much you scale beyond your current data and CPU limits, your migrations will not speed up because you've hit the log limit. So it's important to note that, and we'll talk about some of the best practices on how to work with this. With that, I will stop this demo, come back to my presentation, and continue discussing the learnings of this. Okay. So one of the key things to understand when you do migrations is both DMA and DMS automatically take care of database objects like foreign keys, triggers, constraints, non-clustered indexes. They don't need to be manually taken care of during migrations. For example, foreign keys are disabled before performing the bulk insert, and they are re-enabled automatically by the tool. Again, the same for non-clustered indexes. They are disabled and rebuilt after the insert is done. If a target table is not empty, it's truncated. And again, if there are errors due to foreign key constraints, all the triggers on the table are disabled and the rows are deleted in batches. Also, bulk insert, which is utilized by some of these tools, do not fire triggers on the table. So some of the key concepts in making sure that your migrations are as seamless as possible without any manual intervention. Now, if your target table is a heap, then DMA and DMS can load data in parallel, giving you that extra oomph to make your migrations faster than usual. So again, that is only subject to your target tables being heap. Now, you can, in instances where you're not hitting the log IO limit, which we just show, you can use multiple DMA and DMS to speed up migrations. However, if your log IO or log generation rates are higher to about 70–80% and coming up to the ceiling, you cannot use multiple DMA and DMS to parallelize your migrations because you're eventually not going to scale beyond that log limit. So keep that in mind. That's an important metric to keep note of during your migrations. And lastly, in some instances, if you don't achieve your intended log ingestion rates of 96 Mbps for Azure SQL Database, except for Hyperscale, which is a consistent 100 Mbps, if you're not hitting that limit, or if it's very low, you need to make sure that you provide enough network bandwidth, or make sure you parallelize it enough so that you can hit that log ingestion rate. So again, these are some of the concepts to keep in mind during database migrations. It's not just about selecting your tables and moving them across, but keeping a track or monitoring these metrics to make sure that your migrations don't end up with interruptions or any technical glitches. So we saw how, just recapping some of these in DMA, you saw how you could do assessments in detail, produce an assessment report, upload it to Azure Migrate to look at it in scale, and then use the same DMA tool to migrate your database to Azure SQL Database, or use DMS to migrate to Azure SQL Managed Instance. And then lastly, I want to hand it back to Rajesh to discuss some of the recommendations on how to do migrations and talk about some of the learnings that we've incorporated in coming up with those recommendations. Rajesh, with that, I will hand it back to you. I'm happy to flick through the slides.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks for the demo showing the end-to-end migration experience with DMA. As Mohammed was showing, the investments that we have made into DMA to keep it simple has been pretty much adopted. We have a lot of capacity that DMA offers in terms of data migration, and you clearly saw that in the demo that Mohammed did, where not only does DMA does data migration, it can also do schema migration, wherein it can become the one-stop tool for both your schema and data migrations. So with that, we also want to touch upon few SQLDB data migration recommendations. This is based on all the learnings that we have had while working closely with customers. And these have been put in a tabular format for the ease of consumption, and typically starting from the source all the way into the network. So on the source, when Mohammed was showing you the demo, the primary bottleneck that happens while you're doing the data migration is reading the data from the source database files. And this will show up in terms of data I/O. And so the latency on the data file matters. So make sure if you have any bottlenecks on those areas, you try to get it resolved or involve your appropriate on-premise resources to leverage and then address those bottlenecks. And then for the VM that's used for running the DMA, typically the only primary bottleneck for this is CPU. And if you are landing in a scenario where you are okay with using a VM on Azure, let's say you have a connectivity, express-out connectivity between your source on-premise SQL Server VM and the Azure target region, you could consider spinning up a CPU-intensive VM like an F series for DMA, or you could decide to keep it on-premise with the faster CPUs on-prem. So that way, you have the VM that is capable enough to suck the data from your on-prem and push it back into the Azure target. And then in case of the DMS, where you want to use the fully managed data migration service, our recommendation is to use the premium 4V core. That way you get the needed capacity to meet your migration needs. And as Mohammed was touching upon, both DMA and DMS automatically takes care of your database objects, like the referential integrity in terms of foreign keys. If there are any triggers, constraints, or non-cluster indexes, those are automatically disabled for the period of the data load, and then they're re-enabled after the data load is completed. So that way, you will have the end-to-end data migration where your data is migrated, but your indexes are also rebuilt towards the end of the migration. And the one recommendation that we want to touch upon on this target SQLDB is the biggest limiting factor in terms of the data migration for SQLDB specifically, because we don't rely on backup and restore, and this is relied on the logical data migration is the log generation rate. And as Mohammed was mentioning, in case of hyperscale, this is a flat 100 Mbps. But in case of singleton DB, which is not in hyperscale tier, this varies based upon the number of cores, which are ceiling of about 96 Mbps at about 8 core. So make sure when you use the target SQL DB, you have spun up at least the business critical Gen 5 8V core. In that case, you get the maximum ceiling of log generation rate, and you also get it on the fastest storage available for a SQL DB tier, which is the business critical. In which case, we are using the local disk, which has the lowest latency. And then in terms of network, in order to support the 100 Mbps network bandwidth, you need to have close to about 800 megabits of network bandwidth. So this is something that you might have to work with your network admin when you're trying to migrate your on-premise database into Azure SQL and you're using a simple tool like a DMA. If you have your Expressor connectivity, make sure you monitor the network usage of the Expressor connectivity and ensure you have enough headroom to accommodate additional 800 megabits needed for the data migration activity. Mohammed, if you can move into the next slide.
Sure.
All right, so those were the recommendations about data migration. We also want to quickly touch upon the other tool, which is the database experimentation assistant. So now that you have migrated your database into SQL DB, the next obvious question your application developer or as part of your functional testing or as part of your perf testing would be, how will my database perform or how will my application perform now that the connection strings are pointed to Azure SQL DB? So in that case, you can explore a first-party tool called the Database Experimentation Assistant. And as initially we touched upon, this is a tool that primarily gears toward A/B testing, wherein you have your source A environment and you also have your target environment B environment, which is in this case is your Azure SQL DB. So before cutting off your production workload or cutting off your production traffic into your SQL DB, you can compare the performance of the workload between A and B, make sure the query performance on your source environment is meeting or exceeding your expectations in the target environment. So this is supported for all the newer versions of SQL. We also support it for both Azure SQL DB and Azure SQL MI. We also have linked up a community blog, tech community blog link in this slide, where we talk about the details around the specific details around how you can use DEA for running it against SQL DB or for SQL MI. If you can move on to the next slide, we just want to touch upon all the migration-related sessions that have been available in DPS. So the current session that you're listening to is understanding your readiness and then migrating your databases to SQL DB. We also have a couple of other sessions delivered by colleagues from our team. This is data modernization best practices and lessons learned through customer engagements. Please do watch them if you want to hear more about all the real-world customer learnings that we have learned from engagements, white gloving engagements from our engineer-led programs. And then in the last session around the app modernization and migration from end to end, we have our colleagues from our team who will go deep dive into the data migration service, walking you through the whole end-to-end experience of how the application migration and the data migration go hand in hand and how you can leverage the first-party fully managed PaaS services to perform those actions. With that, let me move on to the next slide and touch upon some resources. Mohammed, do you want to talk about the recently released data migration guide?
Yeah, sure. So one of the key resources we thought we should take this opportunity to talk about in this session is the data migration guides that we've recently collaborated and compiled for making sure that we provide you with the right information so that you can land on the right tools, technologies, right processes to do your database migration. So if you go to ak.ms SQL migration guide, you can access the new migration guides. Basically, you come to the landing page where we give you guides to migrate to Azure SQL Database, managed instance or VMs, and we also provide you with a list of tools that you can leverage to do these migrations. In this session, we focused on DMA, but there's a whole raft of tools that you can choose based on your workload. So for example, if you look at the Azure SQL Database overview and guide, we give you all the considerations that you have to factor in and choosing the appropriate target type. As you know, Azure SQL Database can be, it has different deployment models, it has different purchasing models and service tiers. So we give you some guidance around how to go about thinking and choosing the right model based on your assessment, but also giving you the tool choices to make sure you use the right tool based on your scenario. So as recommended options, we give you the tools that you can use, and also some alternative options if you want to use some of the native features in SQL Server, like transactional replication, if you choose to do that. So again, these guides are super helpful for you to understand the choice of tools and how you go about doing it. But also, one of the key important things in these guides is migration assets, which are basically a unique set of IP and artifacts built by data migration SQL Ninja teams who come up with these IPs day in and day out as they work with customers, build their expertise. They launch these IP and artifacts that you can leverage. So apart from that, we have extensive documentation on DMA, DMS, and DEA, a whole bunch of blogs that you can refer to. But also, I would recommend you to look at Microsoft Learn, where we have modules to learn not just about Azure SQL, but also tools like DMA, run through some lab type sessions to walk through an end-to-end migration scenario using DMA. I highly recommend you go and leverage this learning experience. Okay, so with that, we wrap up this presentation, and obviously coming to the end of it, we want to thank the sponsors. Microsoft was a primary sponsor for DPS Summit, and we are always here to support Data Platform Geeks and SQL Server Geeks community initiatives, and we appreciate all the effort that's gone into making this conference a huge success. We want to thank you for your time. Sure we capture your feedback on how you found these sessions and DPS Summit overall. So make sure you go and fill out evaluation. Post your selfie with hashtag DPS 2020 to amplify it in social media if you like, and follow the Data Geeks and Data AI Summit on Twitter. With that, thank you very much for your time. And Rajesh and I both appreciate you taking the time to look at migrations, and hopefully you land your databases on Azure SQL seamlessly with our migration and assessment tools. Rajesh, do you want to say anything to wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity, and hope you watch the other Azure sessions and Azure migration sessions, and have a great DPS Summit.